When George Washington stepped into the presidency in April of 1789, he entered an office that had never existed before. Everything about the new American system was fragile. The Constitution was barely 2 years old. The states were still learning how to trust the national government. Across the continent, the Northwest Territories simmered with conflict. And abroad, the major European powers watched the United States with a mixture of skepticism and curiosity. Into this uncertain world stepped a man who had not sought power, but had been called into it once again. Washington understood that every decision he made could set a precedent, and that the survival of this new republic depended on discipline, restraint, and the careful shaping of institutions that would outlive him. One of Washington's earliest challenges was defining the character of the presidency itself. The Constitution outlined the powers of the office, but not the customs, behavior, or traditions that would give it shape. Washington deliberately avoided terms like Your Excellency, settling instead on the simple title Mr. President, signaling that the young republic would avoid the pomp and grandeur of monarchies. He delivered an inauguration speech, not because he had to, but because he believed the nation needed a moment of public unity. His choice created a tradition that every president has followed since. Next, Washington built the first presidential cabinet, not because the Constitution demanded it, but because the presidency needed advisors who could help guide policy. Henry Knox became Secretary of War. Thomas Jefferson took charge of foreign affairs as Secretary of State, and Alexander Hamilton became Secretary of the Treasury. John Adams served as Vice President, though he confessed openly that he had no idea what his responsibilities were. The role had been so poorly defined that Adams once complained it was the most insignificant office ever devised. Washington's leadership would gradually give the executive branch the structure it lacked. At the same time, Washington strengthened the judiciary, the least developed branch of government. The Judiciary Act of 1789 established federal district courts and created the Supreme Court, with John Jay appointed as the first Chief Justice. These steps created the legal backbone of the United States. For the first time, federal laws had a clear mechanism for enforcement, and the balance between state and federal authority began to take form. But perhaps the issue most pressing on the minds of ordinary Americans was the protection of individual rights. Many states, including Massachusetts and Virginia, had ratified the Constitution only on the promise that a Bill of Rights would soon follow. Washington agreed. In his inaugural address, he openly called for clear and permanent protections for freedoms that had been at the heart of the Revolution. Thanks to the work of James Madison, with support from Thomas Jefferson abroad, the Bill of Rights reached Congress in 1789. 10 amendments guaranteeing freedom of speech, religion, trial by jury, and other civil liberties were ratified by December 1791. These amendments did more than protect individual freedoms, they helped secure trust in the new federal government. While Washington worked to build the internal structure of the government, chaos unfolded in the Northwest Territory. The United States expected to expand westward peacefully, but the Native American nations of the region resisted fiercely. Many tribes were supported discreetly by Britain, which had not fully abandoned its influence in the region, despite the end of the Revolutionary War. Washington believed that the United States could not claim to be a functioning nation if it could not defend its own settlers. So he ordered General Josiah Harmer into the Northwest. The campaign turned into a disaster. In 1790, Harmer's troops were overwhelmed near the Miami village of Kekionga. Hundreds of American soldiers died. The American frontier was shaken, and Washington was stunned. Determined to restore order, Washington sent a second force under Major General Arthur Sinclair. But on November 4th, 1791, Sinclair's army suffered one of the worst defeats in American history. More than 600 soldiers were killed in a massive ambush led by the Miami war chief Little Turtle. Proportionally, it remains the deadliest battle the U.S. Army ever fought. The news horrified the country. Washington, furious, blamed Sinclair and demanded answers. Congress launched the first congressional investigation into the executive branch. While faults were found, including failures by Secretary Henry Knox, no one was punished. Instead, the disaster pushed Washington to rebuild the army, raise pay, and reorganize the militia. But not all crises were military. The young nation's finances were in ruins. The federal government inherited a massive debt from the Revolution. The states were still arguing about who should pay for what. The currency system was chaotic. Into this mess stepped Alexander Hamilton, whose brilliance Washington deeply trusted. Hamilton proposed consolidating all state and federal debts into one national debt so that the United States would appear reliable to foreign lenders. He created tariffs, taxes, and government bonds to stabilize revenue. He founded the United States Mint to unify the currency. These reforms, radical for their time, transformed the nation's financial future. However, Hamilton's plan sparked outrage, especially in the South. Many Southern states had already paid their wartime debts and saw a national system as unfair. To secure their support, Hamilton negotiated the Compromise of 1790. The South would support his financial program, and in return, the nation's capital would be moved to a site along the Potomac River, future Washington, D.C. Meanwhile, political divisions hardened. Hamilton and Jefferson clashed repeatedly over the proper size of federal authority. Their conflict led to the creation of America's first political parties. Hamilton and the Federalists pushed for strong central government, economic expansion, and commercial development. Jefferson and Madison's new Democratic-Republican Party championed states' rights, limited federal power, and agrarian values. Washington disliked parties, fearing they would divide the nation, but he could not stop what had already begun. By 1793, the cabinet was splintering. Jefferson resigned as Secretary of State, frustrated by Hamilton's growing influence. Public opinion became increasingly polarized. Even foreign events such as the French Revolution became political flashpoints dividing Americans over whether liberty abroad mirrored the ideals of their own revolution or threatened to destabilize them. This was the world Washington faced midway through his presidency. Military disasters in the frontier, economic instability, partisan division, and an uncertain international environment. Yet despite all this, he continued building a system meant to last far beyond his lifetime.
As Washington entered the later years of his presidency, the weight of foreign affairs pressed more heavily on his administration. The French Revolution, which began as a struggle for liberty, had spiraled into violence and radicalism. While many Americans initially celebrated the French uprising as a sister movement to their own revolution, Washington saw something more troubling taking shape. The executions, the political chaos, and the rise of new factions in France signaled that the European balance of power was shifting rapidly. When France went to war with Britain in 1792, both powers expected the United States to take a side. France pointed to the old alliance of 1778, signed during America's own war for independence. Britain, on the other hand, remained a massive economic partner, essential to American trade. Any move toward one side risked immediate retaliation from the other. Washington's solution was the Neutrality Proclamation of 1793. He declared that the United States would take no part in the wars of Europe. The decision sparked outrage among Jefferson's Democratic Republicans, who believed America owed France support for its help during the Revolution. But Washington believed neutrality was necessary for survival. The nation was still too weak, too divided, and too economically unstable to fight another global war. Neutrality, he felt, was not a betrayal, it was a strategy for independence. French Ambassador Edmond Charles Genet, however, refused to accept this position. He traveled through the United States, encouraging Americans to privately support France by raiding British ships. His actions threatened to drag the United States directly into the conflict. Washington demanded his recall, but when Genet learned he might be executed upon his return to France, Washington quietly allowed him to remain in America. This small act of compassion helped avoid further diplomatic disaster. But tensions with Britain continued to rise. British ships continued to seize American vessels accused of trading with France. Washington knew the country could not go to war with Britain, so he sent Chief Justice John Jay to London to negotiate. The resulting Jay Treaty of 1794 was imperfect. Many Americans saw it as too favorable to the British, but it prevented a war and secured British withdrawal from frontier forts. In the same year, Thomas Pinckney's treaty with Spain in 1795 opened the Mississippi River to American trade and settled southern border disputes. These diplomatic victories stabilized America's position on the world stage and ensured peaceful growth. Meanwhile, at home, Washington faced an internal threat that tested the strength of the new federal government, the Whiskey Rebellion. Hamilton's whiskey tax, though economically strategic, provoked outrage among Western farmers who relied on distilling to survive. In 1794, violence erupted in western Pennsylvania. Tax collectors were attacked, property was destroyed, and the rebellion began to resemble Shays' Rebellion of 1786, a dangerous reminder of the government's old weaknesses under the Articles of Confederation. Washington refused to let those days return. For the first and only time as president, he personally led an army, nearly 13,000 men, to suppress the uprising. The rebels fled before the federal forces arrived. Washington's show of strength proved that the new republic could enforce its laws. It demonstrated a balance he had always tried to maintain: firm authority without tyranny, national order without oppression. The government would listen to the people, but it would not allow armed resistance to replace democratic change. At the same time, events in the Northwest Territory reached a turning point. After the disasters under Harmer and St. Clair, Washington supported a new campaign under General Anthony Wayne. Wayne reorganized, retrained, and disciplined the army, transforming it into an effective fighting force. In 1794, at the Battle of Fallen Timbers, Wayne's army defeated the Native American Confederation. The Treaty of Greenville in 1795 ceded much of the Northwest Territory to the United States. It was a controversial victory, one that secured American expansion while deepening the losses of indigenous nations. But it brought an end to years of bloodshed and established American control over the frontier. With domestic order reinforced, foreign crises managed, and the economy stabilized, Washington was finally ready to consider stepping down. Many expected him to serve a third term. He was universally respected, and most Americans feared political chaos without him. But Washington never saw the presidency as his personal possession. He believed that true leadership required knowing when to let go. After 8 years, he felt his work was complete. By 1796, Washington decided that the younger nation needed new leaders who could navigate its future without the shadow of its first. Before leaving office, he issued a final message to the nation, his farewell address. Written with help from Alexander Hamilton and James Madison, the address offered guidance for the country's future. Washington warned against permanent foreign alliances, arguing that America must avoid becoming entangled in European rivalries. He cautioned against parties, which he feared would divide citizens and place factional interests above national unity. He urged Americans to cherish the Constitution, respect the rule of law, and see themselves not as members of competing regions or classes, but as citizens of a single nation. Though he could not prevent the rise of partisan politics or foreign entanglements, Washington's counsel shaped American diplomacy for generations. His neutrality policy became the cornerstone of U.S. foreign relations for almost a century. His warning about parties foreshadowed the bitter conflict that would follow between Adams and Jefferson, and his example of stepping down voluntarily established a tradition of limited presidential power that endured until the 20th century. When he finally left office in March 1797, Washington returned to Mount Vernon. He hoped to spend his final years in peace, tending to his farm and family. But even in retirement, the nation looked to him for guidance. Political leaders still sought his opinion. Foreign governments still measured their approach to the United States based on his legacy. Though he no longer held any formal power, his influence remained immense. George Washington died in December 1799, less than 3 years after leaving the presidency. His death brought national mourning unlike anything the young country had ever seen. For many Americans, Washington was not just a leader, but a symbol of independence, sacrifice, unity, and the possibilities of a republic built on reason and virtue. He had guided the United States through war, revolution, and the uncertain dawn of self-government. He had shaped the presidency, strengthened the Union, defended the frontier, and protected the fragile experiment of American democracy. His achievements were far from perfect. His presidency left unresolved tensions with Native American nations, contributed to the rise of partisan division, and expanded federal power in ways that would later spark fierce debate. But Washington's greatest legacy was not a single policy or victory. It was the example he set. By embracing power, yet refusing to be consumed by it, by leading without dominating, and by stepping aside at the height of his influence, he proved that a republic could survive not through force, but through character. George Washington entered the presidency facing chaos and uncertainty. He left it having built the foundations of a stable nation. And even today, more than 2 centuries later, the office he shaped still carries the weight of his ideals. Principles forged in the earliest days of the American experiment, when its survival was far from assured.